Hello from Doha, Adrian Finnegan here with some of the stories we're covering right now at Al Jazeera. US President Barack Obama says he's deeply concerned over reports of a Russian military buildup in the Crimea. Russian transport planes have reportedly flown across the border and landed troops in the semi-autonomous region of Ukraine. The caretaker government in Kiev says that it's an act of open aggression. Russia says the military movements are not unusual. Hoda Abdulhamid has the latest now from the Crimean capital, Simferopol.
When we asked the men in black who you are, they said, well, we're the self-defense unit, exactly like the ones that were in Maidan in Kiev. Now, they're saying that they are safeguarding the constitution of this region. They're also saying that they would like to see Yanukovych return to the country. They say it's not necessarily about him. It's about having a process continue. They say that they would like to see the presidential elections this year.
How much has changed between Thursday and Saturday here? Then a smallish crowd of protesters outside Parliament. Now the building guarded by armed troops, and the same civilians issue you orders. Go back, be gone. They enjoy this power. It isn't just the Parliament building and Parliament itself which have been lost to Kiev. The blockades have spread to places like the police and security services headquarters. Overnight, the state TV channel was plunged into darkness. We saw military figures inside the perimeter. The airport and apparently airspace also controlled by people who want to keep Ukraine's influence out of here, even on civilian flights. These things don't look like a random series of coincidences. Political institutions, state television, airports, military installations, they're all what Moscow would call strategic objects, and controlling them is crucial if you want to control events. Could it actually be then that Moscow wants to use the Ukrainian revolution as an opportunity to try to regain Crimea? Of course, plenty of people here like all this. All these people in Sevastopol said they would love it if Moscow started handing out Russian passports, as they did in breakaway regions of Georgia.
All of us are Russians. We kept our documents because in our souls we are Russians. But we had to accept Ukrainian passports in order to get a pension or to work.
But the speed of all this has left others terrified. At this Ukrainian church, they were holding a service for those killed protesting in Kiev. Now they see troop movements here, a lack of government control, and they're frightened.
We wake up in the morning and don't know what will happen before the day ends. Every day brings surprises. We are very worried.
And we found these Crimean Tatars, whose ancestors were deported from here by Stalin, defending their own TV channel with sticks.
Putin gave these orders. It's impossible a head of state doesn't know he's intimidating another country. He warned us his troops are massing on the border, that they have tanks ready. They were just looking for a reason.
Of course, the Russians would say it's ridiculous to say they're invading a place where they already have a military presence, and not at all strange to want to claim a place which has historically belonged to them. Lawrence Lee, Al Jazeera, Crimea.
Now the tension is rising not just in Crimea, but elsewhere in Ukraine. In the east of the country, in Kharkiv, pro-Russian supporters turned out in large numbers. At first, it was peaceful. Then there were clashes as pro-European demonstrators who'd been occupying a local government building were confronted by rival groups. The crisis in the country has stirred up new anger in the east against Kiev.
Our territory should become part of what used to be the Soviet Union. That is what we demand, and that's why we are here.
In 1991, it was a bandit-like takeover of Ukraine, and now we've come here for justice, so that Russia would be the legal successor to the Soviet Union. We want to be back in the Soviet Union.
In the capital, the new Ukraine cabinet met in emergency session to discuss the Russian-backed incursion into Crimea.
A disproportionate Russian presence on the territory of the Crimea is nothing but a provocation, and Russia's attempts to make Ukraine react in the same forceful way have failed. We clearly understand that the plan was to create a new Ossetia on the territory of Ukraine with victims, blood, war and civil conflict.
But for the new administration in Kiev, the difficulties are growing as President Putin asked Parliament to formalize the presence of Russians on Ukraine's soil. All this as those in Independence Square are still reeling from the deaths of protesters.
Here, just a short distance away from Independence Square, was one of the main barricades where many were killed. Now, it's a blanket of flowers. It's the 9th day of mourning, a significant moment in the Orthodox calendar.
But now it's events 800 kilometers away in Crimea that are worrying the people here. Tim Friend, Al Jazeera, Kiev.
Foreign military involvement can clearly get approved quickly in Russia. Barely 3 hours after Vladimir Putin requested parliamentary consent, he got it unanimously. 90 senators were present for this extraordinary session. All said yes.
We have to protect Crimea. We have to protect those people who are patriotic, who have a normal political viewpoint. Under no circumstances should we abandon Crimea. Didn't we realize that if this plague seizes Crimea, the Black Sea Fleet won't be there anymore?
And there was a further worrying development for international relations.
We support the proposal to recommend that the President recalls the ambassador from the USA. We support him in revoking the ambassador from this empire of lies.
Whether more Russian troops deploy to Ukraine, and if so, how many, depends on Vladimir Putin, the commander-in-chief of Russia's military. And what of Russian public opinion? Well, of course, that hinges on what happens in the days to come. But many Russians feel protective towards their ethnic brothers and sisters across the border in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin's approval ratings are already sky high after the Winter Olympics, and successful action in Ukraine may send them higher still. Meanwhile, in Kiev, the people of Maidan worry about where their revolution is taking them, and Western governments agonize over what to do next. Rory Challens, Al Jazeera, Moscow.
We start this news hour with the continuing crisis in Ukraine. There's been a flurry of diplomatic activity following the buildup of Russian forces in and around the semi-autonomous region of Crimea. Elsewhere in the country, there have been confrontations between pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian demonstrators. In a moment, we'll speak to Roslyn Jordan about the latest conversation between the U.S. and Russian presidents. But first, James Bays joins us from UN headquarters in New York, where an emergency session has just ended. James, a very rare open meeting of the UN Security Council being held. Tough words there, but no agreement.
Well, you quite often have open sessions of the Security Council, but not on an issue on which they are divided like this. Now, this was going to be a closed session of the Security Council, but then actually it was the Ukrainian ambassador who appealed to his Western colleagues to try and get this made an open session. After a bit of wrangling with the Russians, who didn't really want it to be an open session, it was decided to have the meeting in public, and the Ukrainian ambassador made this appeal.
We urge all member states of the United Nations to demonstrate solidarity with the Ukrainian nation to protect sovereignty and territorial integrity of the country, to protect the very basic principles of the United Nations, currently brutally violated by a permanent a permanent member of the Security Council.
A very different version of events, though, by that permanent member, Russia. The Russian ambassador saying that, yes, his president has asked for authorization for a military force, but that military force has not yet been sent to the Ukraine. And he added this.
I'd like to draw your attention to the fact it says on the territory of Ukraine, not against Ukraine, as my Ukrainian colleague said, until the normalization of the political situation in this country.
Well, those comments were then responded to by the US ambassador, Samantha Power.
I'd like to take a moment to respond to the comments made here by the representative of the Russian Federation. Actions speak louder than words. Early this morning, the Russian Duma acted to authorize the use of military force in Ukraine. This is as dangerous as it is destabilizing. We are deeply disturbed by reports this morning of Russian military intervention into Crimea. This intervention is without legal basis. Indeed, it violates Russia's commitment to protect the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of Ukraine. It is time for the Russian intervention in Ukraine to end.
So, James, the Security Council deadlocked once again. What now?
Well, I don't think there's going to be much further for the councils of the Security Council to go, the countries of the Security Council to go on this. They will continue to meet on it, but it looks like there's going to be no agreement around the Security Council table. There is deadlock, and remember, Russia, central to all of this, has a veto at the Security Council. The Security Council met in that open session. They then had some closed briefings. While I've been speaking to you, those closed briefings have ended. We expect again in the next few minutes to hear from some of those ambassadors briefing the press.
Yes, and a NATO meeting has also been called. James, thank you very much. James Bays there at UN headquarters in New York. Now, U.S. President Barack Obama spent 1.5 hours on the phone with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Saturday. For more on that, Roz and Jordan joins us now from Washington, D.C. Roz, what did they say?
Well, it was a very tough conversation from the U.S. perspective, Shax, and that's because in this 90-minute phone call, the president, Barack Obama, made it very plain to the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, that in the U.S.'s view, the incursion of Russian troops inside Ukraine, including inside Crimea, is a clear violation of Russia's commitment to international laws and standards. The U.S. is calling on Russia to recall those troops and to send those troops who are based inside Crimea to rebase them immediately. And the president also said that if Russia has issues with the interim government of Ukraine, that there are international venues for both countries to resolve their disputes, and that the U.S. is prepared to support them as they negotiate. Now, that sounds like good language, at least, trying to pull things back. But then there is this. The U.S. has decided that it's going to suspend its preparation for the upcoming G8 summit in Sochi in late June. That's just where the Winter Olympics were, and they just wrapped up a week ago. But the U.S. is indicating that a venue that it typically counts on in order to coordinate and to deepen policy ties with the other most economically vibrant countries in the world, including Russia, it's decided that unless the situation in Ukraine is changed appreciably for the better, the U.S. is not going to be participating in the G8 summit. Further, the U.S. is warning Russia that if it does not pull back and stop what the U.S. considers an aggravation of the situation in Ukraine, that Russia is going to risk a deepening of political and economic isolation. That is very tough language, Shax.
All right, Roz, thank you very much. Roz and Jordan, live for us from Washington, D.C. with the U.S. reaction to what's happening in Ukraine.
Ambassador, how concerned are you about the situation?
Very deeply. We need de-escalation.
Ambassadors arriving for the second crisis meeting of the Security Council in 24 hours. Ambassador, is your country invading Crimea? The Russian ambassador not answering my question, but aware he would face strong criticism from other Security Council members, particularly Western nations.
La 7124e séance du Conseil de sécurité est ouverte.
Cameras were finally allowed to film the meeting, despite initial Russian opposition. Ukraine's ambassador appealed to the international community.
We call upon the Security Council to do everything possible now to stop aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine. There is still a chance.
This is as dangerous as it is destabilizing. We are deeply disturbed by reports this morning of Russian military intervention into Crimea. This intervention is without legal basis. Indeed, it violates Russia's commitment to protect the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of Ukraine.
Russia's ambassador presented a very different version of events. He put the blame squarely on the EU for causing the crisis.
Why did this problem need to result in demonstrations?
Why is it that these street demonstrations need to be encouraged from abroad, encouraged by people from the EU?
While the Security Council met, President Obama called President Putin, a call we're told that lasted 90 minutes. What is the message from the US to President Putin right now?
The message is, pull back your forces. Let us engage in political dialogue. Engage with the Ukrainian government, which is reaching out to you for that dialogue. The occupation, the military presence in Crimea is a violation of international law.
The Security Council is deadlocked. This is a crisis in which Russia is accused by other Security Council members of hostility, and yet Russia has a veto and can block any action. The focus of diplomatic activity will now move to Brussels, where NATO and then the EU will be meeting. James Bays, Al Jazeera at the United Nations.
Vocal Russian-speaking Crimeans increasingly believe it is time to right a historical wrong and return Crimea to Mother Russia. Annexed 3 centuries ago, Crimea was handed to Ukraine by the USSR in the 1950s. A large minority, mainly Ukrainians and Tatars, support Ukrainian unity, but the majority of the peninsula's 2.3 million people are pro-Russian. With those statistics, a referendum tabled for the end of the month could lead to a breakaway, hitting Crimea's new administration in open revolt against Kiev.
We think that our Crimean government and parliament are completely legitimate. All the decisions made were with the legal framework of Ukraine. The majority of the Crimean parliament elected its cabinet of ministers, and we have the agreement of Ukraine President Viktor Yanukovych.
This defiance depends on Russian support. In the form of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, that support is already there. Under an existing agreement with Ukraine, Russia's military can stay in Crimea until at least 2042. Some believe the armed men that look suspiciously like Russian troops now deployed across Crimea is clear payback from Vladimir Putin.
Putin's role is massive in this. I think so far what it's turning out, Ukraine is turning out another foreign policy defeat for him. So he's really stepping in now and intervening. And I think, the military intervention we're seeing, I think we are, the pictures are there are Russian boots on Ukrainian soil. So he is trying to still disturb the process as much as he can. With his understanding, if he can't have all of Ukraine, he'll have chunks of it.
This looks like a show of unity, but Crimea is ethnically, ideologically divided.
The people on this square have been shouting slogans including "Crimea is not Ukraine." But according to international agreements, it certainly is. International agreements signed by Russia, the United Kingdom, the United States and France, as well as Ukraine, and that's why this threatens turning into an international crisis.
This is a dangerous moment for Crimea and the region. Robin Forrestier-Walker, Al Jazeera, Simferopol.